It's being called the American Awakening. Where is the U.S. Occupy movement headed? Is the government concerned that things are getting out of control? And how close are Occupy protesters to realizing their demands? Are the police getting too violent in their crackdown? Is more tension inevitable? I'm Homa Lesgi, and this is another edition of News Analysis. First off, I'd like to introduce our guest. Joining us now, American writer and poet Lynn Din from Philadelphia and co-director of International Action Center, Sarah Flounders from Washington. Welcome to this edition of News Analysis. First question I'll put to Sarah Flounders in Washington. Sarah, the police crackdown has been growing. They've arrested many people so far. Police violently tore down a tent camp in Oakland on Monday. At least 3 people have been killed in mysterious circumstances. 2 war veterans have been brutally injured by the police. But still, no government official has come out to apologize or to sympathize with the protesters. Is this a sign of a growing divide between the ruling elite and the ordinary American?
Well, very much so. You have a government that on the local, the state, and the federal level, the national level, is more and more out of touch with the growing urgent needs of the average person. That's the basis of the whole, this whole organized, really struggle against the 1% who reap the benefits and the 99% who pay for it and are increasingly at risk. One thing is that each act of repression by the police has actually led to greater resistance and a higher level of organization. So far, it has not succeeded in any city in shutting down the occupations. It has enabled the forces there to gather wider support from new layers, from the union movement, from religious, from social justice organizations. And that's important because there are many, many people, whether they're able to camp out all night, every day, and so on, or not, who want this movement to succeed. And they step forward when the police try to shut it down. Now, there's also an effort by the media to somehow paint this movement as violent. And it's always important to know that violence in this country comes from the police, just like it comes from the U.S. military around the world. It's an effort again and again to repress while baiting and attacking this movement, which is a movement to occupy space and put forth demands. They want to picture it as a violent movement. It's not that at all. The violence in every single case has come from the police.
Right, and we'll come back to the question of how these protesters are being portrayed in the media, especially in the U.S. But first of all, let's put this next question to Lynn Din from Philadelphia. Lynn, more Americans are losing their homes, we know. A recent Gallup poll finds that only 44.5% of American adults received health insurance from an employer in the third quarter of 2011. Another recent Gallup report shows that 20% of Americans, or over 60 million of them, were not able to bring food to the table for themselves or their families over the past year. Now, against this backdrop, what do you think will be the future of the protest movement against the economic, social, the political inequalities?
Okay, just as you said, many Americans are directly threatened by this collapsing economy. The situation is so precarious that they can be fired tomorrow. They're making less money. So the Occupy movement is a kind of a symbolic homelessness. So these people are living so poorly and are camping out in the hearts of American cities to vividly demonstrate to the rest of the world that they are just a step away from being homeless. And what's interesting is that the actual homeless people are moving into these camps. So there's a blurring of real homeless people and those who are for now only symbolically homeless. But what's interesting is that if you think about it, every homeless person is already a protester, whether he has a sign in front of him or not. Because in a country that wastes so much money on the Pentagon, on the military, there shouldn't be that many homeless people. And every American city, every American town, you can see the homeless people. So these tent cities will only grow as the economy collapses further.
Okay. Now, Sarah, you were saying in your remarks earlier that a lot of people have been portraying these protesters as people who are seeking violence, who are creating violence. And another criticism that these protesters have been facing is people saying that they are, for instance, not aware of what they're doing, that they are illiterate people who don't know what their main demands are, do not have a specific set of demands or a specific timetable for meeting those demands, for instance, or a specific set of actions. What do you say to that kind of criticism?
Well, this is a new movement that represents many, many demands and many needs. And it actually takes on a different character in almost every city. And yet everywhere the focus is the same. Everywhere the focus is on the disastrous problems that working people face and who has benefited, which is a tiny, tiny percentage, not even 1%, maybe 1/100th of 1% if we were really to talk about the banks, the big corporations, at a time of growing homelessness, really growing hunger in the U.S., and also young people, extremely articulate, well-educated, who have no future, who have no hope of having a job, who even have no capacity to pay off tens of thousands of dollars in student loans. So all of these issues coming together, it's young people, many of them very skilled, who are helping to organize these occupations. And their own demands and needs have actually grown as they themselves have taken on this experience. I think in the last 2 months we've seen a real transformation as the ability to reach out to other sectors in the U.S. has grown. And experience grows. People's understanding of what's the real problem of corporate capitalism in the U.S. that has no solution for the average person, is really at a dead end, unable to provide jobs, unable to provide the social needs that people have a right to expect. This is the richest country in the world,
right,
and there is a right to housing, there's a right to health care and to education, and this is what's being cut back. You have a super committee in Congress meeting on how they can implement cuts that are just beyond the comprehension of most people in the U.S. So what's coming, what we can see ahead of us, is actually worse conditions. And so a lot of the occupations are really taking up the day next Wednesday when this super committee releases their findings. Well, there's going to be actions around the country with a demand to occupy for jobs. So this is an unfolding movement. It's and people are also making determined efforts to stay through the winter. That's quite an interesting development.
Let's go back to Philadelphia now. Lyndon, the Republican presidential hopefuls had a foreign policy debate the other day, and in that foreign policy debate, all of them except for Ron Paul focused on attacking Iran, waging another war. Well, with 20% of Americans unable to have enough money to buy food, why do you think there's all this talk about another war when, of course, one of the major demands that's been voiced in these protest movements has been the demand for an end to the wars that the U.S. is currently engaged in?
Sure, the government wants to attack yet another country to distract attention from problems at home. And I see a big problem here. This movement is called itself the 99%, and it is that. But there is a kind of a disagreement between the conservative Americans and the liberal Americans. And the conservative Americans are also against corruption, but they support the Pentagon. They support U.S. military foreign policy, whereas the liberals are against corruption, but against the Pentagon. So there has to be a kind of a consensus to be reached in that Americans have to be persuaded to understand that U.S. imperialism is not just bad for Iran or Iraq or Libya or so many other countries. It's also bad for the USA. We're not just killing other people, we're killing ourselves. So how can you not be against corruption? Corruption is just stealing money. I mean, you can't be for corruption, but so many Americans are still misled into supporting our military because they are persuaded somehow that a country like Iran is a threat to the USA. Whereas it's exactly the opposite. The USA is threatening Iran. Iran is not a threat to the USA at all. So I think hopefully in the future that people can be persuaded to realize that the Pentagon is as bad as the bank, a major source of corruption.
Right. Sarah, speaking of the demands, the wide range of demands of the protesters, of course, those who are calling themselves the 99%, one of the demands has been against the wars, of course, and against waging any new wars. Other demands include economic reforms, of course, the demands against the bailing out of banks and the demands against the current corporate greed. Now, the question is, who is going to represent this 99% in the future shape of politics in the US? Do you think they don't need a more specific leadership to move ahead with these demands when we are speaking in practical terms of how they could be met?
Well, every new movement, leadership emerges from it as people gain experience and are tested in many different ways. And new forces come into a movement also as it moves forward and gains a certain momentum, gains strength. The demands against the war, against the Pentagon, are extremely important because time and again in the U.S., a way out of an economic crisis has been war. And it is devastating for people here, but massively destructive against the countries that are the targets of U.S. war. What's been done to Iraq, to Afghanistan is criminal, absolutely criminal. And the threats on Iran and the sanctions on Iran are also a form of war against Iran's right to develop. And that is what the U.S. corporate power wants to stop. They want to stop the development of other countries around the world because it competes with their narrow corporate interests. Right. And so they threaten countries, economies around the world. But it's important that there's a movement here that is beginning to see those connections. It's at an early stage.
Okay.
And everything that can be done to help make those connections is important.
Okay. I'd just like to introduce politician, academic and writer, Mr. Joel Covell, who's joining us now live from New York. Thank you for being with us. And I'd just like to put this question to you as well. The protesters have been disavowing both the Democrats and the Republicans, saying that they are represented by neither of them. Do you think it is premature, though, to predict that the Occupy movement will lead, for instance, to the formation of a new political party in a new political system?
That's certainly premature, but not immature. I mean, I've been doing this kind of thing for 45 years, and I've never seen anything like it. And I think we have to grasp just the extent and scope of the crisis that's animating it. It surfaces in innumerable individual values or outrages or protests, but basically it has the look of a real historical transformation. There have been other major movements in my lifetime, like against the Vietnam War, but for instance, Nixon was able to stop that just by ending the draft. You can't really stop this unless you change the system itself. We're not talking about even forming a new party, although a new party might be an important step in the road of changing the system. So I think that what we're really facing here is a very fundamental crisis in our whole civilization. The other speakers haven't even talked about what is probably the most important part of all this, which is the ecological collapse, the rising climate change, and the fact that our whole civilization is under great threat, and it's all a threat from the same problem, which is the capitalist system as it expands, and therefore people are desperate, and they're looking for basically new means of transformation.
Right, Mr. Covell, there has been this analysis that was just mentioned there that you said some people would be saying that nothing can be achieved or not much could be achieved if the whole entire political system is not dismantled. If you agree with that analysis, do you think then if the U.S. government in a matter of months, for instance, or a year, does come up with something that could be called maybe a minor surgery on the financial system, that it would still not convince the protesters, that they would still be seeking a major overhaul of the financial system?
That's my reading of it. Of course, there will be other changes along the way, and these are to the good. I mean, the Wall Street movements have already changed the tenor of the political debate in this country, moving it sharply to the left, and that's a very good thing. The right-wingers, the Tea Party people and so forth are reeling and in kind of a state of panic. We don't know how that's all going to turn out, but I would emphasize that no matter what we do, and we have to do things in the real world, we have to change, paybacks of student loans, we have to change mortgage rates and so on and so forth, but none of that's going to settle the problem of capitalism, which is now, I think, in a crisis of real terminal proportions. We've been talking about this a long time, but I don't think the capitalist system is going to be able to pull out of this crisis. And it's been going on now for 3 years and more. Of course, the deeper roots go on a lot longer than that. And I think people are perceiving that. Of course, they also have the technical means of communicating with each other continuously. And that opens up new pathways and new possibilities. So all in all, this is one of the most, I wouldn't say one of the most exciting political development I've ever seen in 45 years of activism.
Okay, back to
I don't know
Philadelphia
how it's
now.
going to turn out, but I know that a lot of people are in motion and feeling very excited about it.
All right, Mr. Lin Din, speaking about this major financial or political overhaul in the United States, well, one of the demands voiced by the protesters has been against what they call the military-industrial complex, for instance, and the military-banking relationship. If you were to say what is at stake now for the U.S., is it corporations, is it more about Wall Street, is it this military-banking relationship, or is it capitalism as a whole? What would you say?
Well, basically, it's corruption, and it's the criminal banks, which are represented by the Federal Reserve, which has a power to generate money out of nothing, and then the Pentagon, which is this major source of corruption. But anyway, I agree with Joe too. The ecological issue in that capitalism is predicated on growth, and I think growth is over. I mean, and the United States has to come to terms with that. In that this country cannot grow anymore because there are ecological limits. There are, so that is something that most of the public is not aware of. So and it's a huge challenge in how to manage not growth but contraction, and that's a very difficult issue. And no one is addressing it at the moment.
Right, and I'll put the last question to Sarah before we run out of time.
I don't think capitalism can deal with contraction.
Okay, Sarah, if you could also give your conclusive remarks on this as well, of what you think. Do you think that the Obama administration, the next U.S. government, is willing to bring about those major changes, or is that's not going to happen too soon?
Well, I think
I don't think they can bring about major changes.
If Sarah could answer this, please. Go ahead.
Okay. I think they are incapable of making these changes because they're absolutely bound up. The political system is completely bound and serves corporate power in the U.S. Who can run for office? It takes millions and millions of dollars. It takes corporate backing, and that is who political power in the U.S. serves. So you have a system that is literally at a dead end, unable to find its way out of this problem. And in order for the corporations to make any kind of a profit, they can only do so with huge government bailouts. We're talking about the bailout of the banks, they're now telling us, is in the magnitude of about $20 trillion. And this is after decades of the Pentagon handing the corporate power in the U.S. huge bailouts in the form of almost $1 trillion a year of a military budget, which is really all about puffing up, making the corporations in the U.S. profitable. So they are at an end game on this, and what's happening, and you look at the Occupy movement, is that the average person in the U.S. is beginning to realize, and it's a beginning, but beginning to realize that there's not a recovery on the horizon, that this system is incapable of meeting their needs. So it's at a beginning stage of looking at real alternatives and also how to resist. But this is a historic movement just emerging at the right time and everything that forces around the country can do to defend this movement, to help it grow, is a real contribution to humanity at this point, to a global change that's needed.
Okay, I'm just hearing that we have just under a minute left, so I'll allow Mr. Coel to go ahead with his remarks. I believe, Mr. Coel, you were trying to make some comment there, and also your concluding remarks about whether the U.S. is capable of meeting these demands. Go ahead.
Right. Well, I agree absolutely with everything the previous speakers just said. I think that if we survive as a civilization, 2011 will go down in our history as a major turning point towards a more healthy and sane society. But let's not be in any way deluded by how severe the problem is. When Obama came into office, he wanted to prosecute Bush and Cheney for their war crimes. And he was told before his administration started by his aides that there probably would be a coup d'etat if he tried to do that. And I think we have to be very, very clear just how deeply ingrained and how totally corrupt and murderous this system is, and we have to take appropriate measures.
Okay, I'm afraid we've run out of time. A big thank you there to politician, academic and writer Mr. Joel Coel in New York. A big thank you as well to American writer and poet Lyndon in Philadelphia and co-director of International Action Center Sarah Flounders in Washington. Thank you so much for staying with us. And you viewers, you can also check out all the latest information here on Press TV by simply clicking on the address of our website, presstv.ir. And while you're there on our homepage, you can find the American Awakening section, a complete section by itself, which includes all the interviews here that have been conducted on Press TV, all the latest news and videos coming on the American Occupy movement. That's all on presstv.ir. Do check it out. Stay with us. I'll be back with the international headlines.